At 1 in the morning, the city stretched beneath a blanket of neon and shadow, its secrets buried deep beneath concrete and corruption. When a ruthless mafia kingpin received a trembling call from a little girl whose voice cracked with terror as she whispered, "My mom is dying. She says you are my dead." What he didn't know was that the woman clinging to life was the only soul who had ever made him feel human, and the desperate child begging for salvation carried his blood, his eyes, and the power to shatter every wall he'd spent 6 years building. Tonight, the past would drag him back into the light, and the heart he'd convinced himself was stone would be forced to beat again. The city's pulse thrummed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Damien Rourke's penthouse, a rhythm of distant sirens and muted jazz bleeding up from the streets 40 stories below. He sat alone in the darkness, his silhouette carved against the glittering skyline, a king surveying an empire built on fear and sealed with blood. Silver chains glinted at his throat and wrists, tokens of power that felt more like shackles tonight. His slicked-back hair caught the amber light of a single lamp, and his jaw was set in that familiar hardness, the expression of a man who had stopped expecting warmth from the world. The clock on his mahogany desk blinked 1 a.m. Sleep had become a stranger these past 6 years, ever since Jenna Hayes had walked out of his life with nothing but a letter that read, "I can't watch you disappear into the man you're becoming." He'd let her go, told himself it was mercy, told himself that loving him was a death sentence she didn't deserve. But on nights like this, when the city fell silent and his empire felt hollow, Damien wondered if he'd made the greatest mistake of his life. His phone vibrated once against the leather desk, the sound sharp and intrusive in the cathedral-like quiet. Damien's eyes narrowed. No one called at this hour. Those who'd tried without permission rarely got the chance to make that mistake twice. But something about the way the phone trembled, insistent, desperate, alive, made him reach for it against every instinct, screaming danger. He answered, his voice a low rasp that could freeze blood. "You have 10 seconds to explain why you're still breathing." What came through the line stopped his heart cold. A child's voice, small and shattered, choked with tears. "Please, please, you have to come. My mom, she's dying. She told me to call you. She said..." The girl's voice broke into sobs. "She said you're my day." The world tilted. Damien's grip on the phone turned white-knuckled, his breath trapped somewhere between his lungs and his throat. He stood without thinking, the leather chair scraping violently across marble. "Who is your mother?" His voice cracked on the question, betraying the steel facade he'd perfected over decades. The child's breathing was ragged, panicked, like she was hiding from something terrible. "Jenna Hayes. Her name is Jenna Hayes, and she's..." A gasp. "There's so much blood. Please, I don't know what to do. She made me promise to call this number. She said you'd come." Jenna. The name detonated in his chest like a bullet he'd been carrying for 6 years. Jenna, who'd loved him when he was nothing. Jenna, who'd seen the boy beneath the monster and refused to look away. Jenna, who he'd pushed into the darkness to keep her out of his light. "Where are you?" Damien was already moving, throwing on his coat, his hand instinctively finding the cold weight of his gun. "Tell me exactly where you are." The line crackled. Distant voices. A scream. Maybe the child's. Maybe someone else's. Then silence. "Hello? Hello?" Damien's roar echoed through the empty penthouse. He called back to Mayek. Once. Twice. 10 times. Nothing. The line was dead, severed, gone. He stared at the phone in his hand, his reflection ghosting across the black screen. A man who controlled every street, every deal, every breath in this city. Now powerless to reach a dying woman and a child who might carry his blood, his daughter. The word tasted foreign and right all at once. Damien's mind raced through possibilities. Trap, revenge plot, a rival using Jenna's name to draw him out. But that voice, that small, terrified voice, had carried something he couldn't fake. Truth, desperation, and something else that made his chest ache, his own cadence, his own stubborn defiance even in fear. He pulled up the call log, traced the signal with software he'd paid a fortune to acquire. The ping came back from the east side, St. Catherine's Free Clinic, a worn-down facility that served the forgotten corners of the city where his empire's shadow stretched thickest. "If this is a trap," Damien muttered, sliding the gun into his shoulder holster, "they picked the wrong night." But if it wasn't a trap, if Jenna was truly dying, if that child was his, then every second he wasted was a second stolen from a life he should have been living all along. Lightning split the sky as Damien Rourke descended from his tower, leaving behind the king and becoming, for the first time in 6 years, just a man racing toward the only truth that had ever mattered. Somewhere in that rain-soaked city, the woman he'd loved was slipping away. And a child, his child, was waiting for a father she'd never met to prove that monsters could still remember how to save the things they loved. If you've ever run towards something that terrified you because love demanded it, drop a comment telling us where you were watching from. Hit subscribe if you believe even the coldest hearts deserve a chance at redemption. Your support means everything. Damien's car tore through the rain-slicked streets like a bullet searching for flesh, the engine's roar drowning out every rational thought, screaming that this was a trap. St. Catherine's Free Clinic materialized through the downpour, a crumbling relic in the city's forgotten district, its flickering neon cross casting blood-red shadows across cracked pavement. He abandoned the car at the curb, gun already in hand, and kicked through the clinic's double doors hard enough to shatter the safety glass. The waiting room was a graveyard of broken chairs and outdated magazines, empty except for a single nurse who took one look at Damien's face and pointed silently down the hallway. "Room 3, she doesn't have much time." Damien moved like death itself, his footsteps echoing through corridors that reeked of antiseptic and desperation. Room 3's door hung half open, and what he saw inside stopped him cold. Jenna Hayes lay on a gurney beneath harsh fluorescent lights, her skin pale as winter, blood-soaked bandages wrapped around her torso. An IV dripped clear fluid into her arm, but Damien could see she was losing. Losing the fight, losing time, losing everything. Jenna. Her name came out broken, barely human, but it wasn't Jenna who answered. From the shadows beside the gurney, a small figure emerged, a girl no older than 6, wearing a blue dress stained with her mother's blood, dark braids framing a face that made Damien's chest collapse. She had Jenna's delicate features, her fierce spirit burning in eyes that were catastrophically, undeniably his own. Cold, gray, unflinching even as tears streaked down her cheeks. "You came," the girl whispered, and her voice was the same one that had shattered his world an hour ago. "Mom said you would. She said you always keep your promises, even the ones you don't remember making." Damien holstered his gun with trembling hands and dropped to one knee, bringing himself to her eye level. "What's your name?" "Lila." She said it like a challenge, like she was daring him to deny what they both already knew. "Lila Hayes, and you're my father. Mom showed me pictures. She told me stories about the man you used to be before you decided being alone was safer than being loved." The accusation hit harder than any bullet. Damien reached out, hesitated, then gently touched Lila's shoulder. She didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled something from her pocket, a heavy silver medallion on a blood-stained chain, its surface engraved with coordinates he didn't recognize. "Mom made me promise to give you this if something happened to her." Lila pressed the medallion into his palm, her small hand covering his scarred knuckles. "She said it's the key to everything. She said you'd know what to do because you're smarter than you pretend to be and braver than you let yourself believe." Damien closed his fist around the medallion, feeling its weight settle like an anchor. He looked past Lila to Jenna's unconscious form, her chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate rhythms. 6 years. 6 years he'd convinced himself that walking away had saved her, when all he'd done was leave her defenseless against whatever had put her here. "Who did this to your mother?" Damien's voice dropped to something darker than midnight, the kingpin returning with vengeance in every syllable. Lila's eyes, his eyes, hardened with a hatred no child should carry. "A man named Silas. He came looking for something Mom wouldn't give him. When she said no, her voice broke. He hurt her, and then he said he'd come back to finish what he started." The name detonated in Damien's skull. Silas, his former lieutenant, the man he'd exiled 3 years ago for trying to expand operations into human trafficking. The man who'd sworn revenge while Damien's guards dragged him out of the city. Have you ever had to face the consequences of a choice you thought was mercy? Comment below. Damien stood, pulling Lila close against his side, feeling her small body shake with exhaustion and fear. Listen to me carefully. Your mother is not going to die. And Silas is never going to touch either of you again. Do you understand? Lila looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much violence for 6 years of life and nodded once. Does this mean you're staying? Damien pressed his lips to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her mother's shampoo mixed with dried tears. I'm never leaving again. Outside, tires squealed against wetted asphalt. Gunshots shattered the clinic's front windows. And Damien Rourke wrapped his arms around his daughter as the past came crashing through the doors, demanding payment for 6 years of cowardice in blood and fire. The first bullet punched through the clinic's window and embedded itself in the wall 6 inches from Lila's head. Damien moved on pure instinct. Grabbing his daughter, the word felt foreign and right simultaneously, and throwing them both behind the gurney as automatic gunfire shredded the room. Jenna's IV stand exploded in a spray of saline and plastic. The heart monitor flatlined as bullets severed its power cord. And Damien Rourke, who'd spent 6 years pretending to be civilized, felt the monster he'd buried claw its way back to the surface. Stay down, he commanded Lila, his voice cold steel. She nodded once, pressing herself flat against the floor with the practiced fear of a child who'd learned that survival meant obedience. Damien rose just enough to count shadows through the shattered doorway. 4 men, heavy weapons, moving with military precision. Silas had sent professionals. They'd made a fatal mistake. They'd threatened his family. The first enforcer kicked through the door, and Damien was already moving. He caught the man's rifle barrel with his left hand, twisted it upward as a 3-round burst tore into the ceiling, and drove his right elbow into the enforcer's throat with enough force to crush his windpipe. The man dropped, choking on his own crushed larynx, and Damien caught his body as a shield when the second enforcer opened fire from the hallway. Bullets thudded into dead flesh. Damien used the corpse like a battering ram, charging forward and slamming into the second shooter hard enough to send them both crashing through the nurse's station. Glass rained down. Damien's fist found the man's face, missed twice, 3 times, mechanical, merciless. The rhythm of a man who'd killed before he'd learned to love and was remembering exactly how good he'd been at it. The third and fourth enforcers tried to flank him. Damien swept the second shooter's dropped pistol from the floor and fired without looking, trusting muscle memory that had been carved into him through 1,000 violent nights. The third enforcer went down with a hole between his eyes. The fourth managed to get a shot off that grazed Damien's shoulder, burning through expensive fabric and skin. But Damien was already on him, driving the man's head into the concrete wall once, twice, until he stopped moving. Silence fell like a guillotine blade. 4 bodies, 12 seconds. Damien stood into the wreckage, blood on his knuckles, not all of it his, and realized his daughter had watched every second of it. He turned to find Lila standing beside Jenna's gurney, her small hands gripping her mother's, her face pale but steady. Those gray eyes, his eyes, held no fear, only grim understanding. She'd seen what he was, what he'd always been, and she wasn't running. We need to move, Damien said, his voice gentler than the violence still humming through his veins. Can you help me with your mother? Lila nodded. Together they maneuvered Jenna onto a wheeled gurney, Damien's hands surprisingly careful as he secured the IV line and checked her weak pulse. She was fading, minutes from bleeding out internally, and St. Catherine's was compromised. He needed someone he could trust. Dr. Marcus Thorne, his oldest friend, a trauma surgeon who'd patched Damien up after 100 street fights, who'd left the underworld years ago to run a private practice on the north side, who owed Damien his life 3 times over and had never asked questions about the blood that stained every favor. Damien pulled out his phone, dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. Thorne answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. This better be death or resurrection, because those are the only reasons to call me at 2 a.m. It's both, Damien said. I'm coming to you. I have a woman with critical internal bleeding and a child who needs protection. No hospitals, no questions. A pause. Then, how bad? Damien looked at Jenna's gray lips, at Lila's terrified courage, at the 4 corpses cooling in the hallway behind him. Bad enough that if she dies, I'm burning this entire city down to find who's responsible. Bring her in through the back entrance. I'll prep the operating room. Subscribe if you believe men who attack dying mothers and innocent children deserve to lose everything. Only cowards like Silas will scroll past. Damien lifted Jenna into his arms. She weighed nothing, a ghost of the woman who'd once made him believe in futures worth living, and carried her through the clinic's shattered remains with Lila running beside him, her hand gripping his jacket. Behind them, sirens wailed. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, Silas was watching, waiting. Let him wait. Let him watch. Because the monster he'd awakened wasn't the king who'd exiled him. It was the father who'd just learned he had something worth killing for again. Dr. Marcus Thorne's private clinic occupied the third floor of a converted brownstone in a neighborhood where money bought silence and questions died before they were asked. Damien carried Jenna through the reinforced back entrance while Lila shadowed his every step, her small hand never leaving the fabric of his coat. Thorne met them in surgical scrubs, his silver hair disheveled, his sharp eyes cataloging the damage with clinical precision. Jesus Christ, Damien, what happened to her? Silas happened. Damien laid Jenna on the surgical table with hands that trembled despite his best efforts. He's back, and he's not just after me anymore. Thorne's face darkened, but he didn't waste time on questions. He was already moving, checking vitals, barking orders to his nurse. Get her stabilized, type and cross-match. Prep for exploratory laparotomy. She's got internal bleeding I can't see yet. His eyes flicked to Lila, who stood frozen beside the table, her mother's blood still staining her dress. Get the child out of here. She doesn't need to watch this. Damien started to protest, but Lila spoke first, her voice small but unbreakable. I'm not leaving my mom. Lila. Damien crouched beside her, meeting those eyes that mirrored his own. Dr. Thorne is the best. He's going to save her. But I need you to trust me and wait in the other room while he works. Can you do that? She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pressed the medallion back into his palm. Mom said this would tell you everything. She said you'd understand once you really looked at it. Her fingers tightened around his. Promise me you will come back. I promise. The words came easier than they should have. Damien led Lila to Thorne's private office, settled her on the leather couch with a blanket, and watched her eyes grow heavy with exhaustion and shock. Within minutes, she was asleep, her small body finally surrendering to the weight of the longest night of her life. Damien returned to the surgical suite's observation window and held the medallion up to the light. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than decorative silver, ornate scrollwork surrounding what looked like random numbers. But as Damien turned it, the angle caught the light differently, and he saw what Jenna had hidden in plain sight. Coordinates engraved so faintly, they were nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them. He pulled out his phone and entered the numbers. The map pin dropped onto First Continental Bank, downtown, one of those old money institutions with vault services that asked no questions and kept no digital records. Beneath the coordinates, etched in letters barely larger than pinpricks, was a box number. 1247. What had Jenna discovered that was worth dying for? What secret had she locked away that Silas was willing to kill an entire family to possess? Damien watched through the glass as Thorne worked with steady hands to save the woman who'd once saved him from becoming nothing but violence wearing human skin. Jenna had walked away 6 years ago because she'd seen what he was becoming, a man so consumed by building his empire that he'd forgotten why empires were supposed to matter. She'd left to survive, and somehow in those 6 years, she'd stumbled into something dangerous enough to bring Silas crawling back. Thorne looked up from the table, caught Damien's eye through the glass, and gave a single nod. She was stabilized. Fighting, not safe, but alive. Damien pocketed the medallion and pulled on his coat. The bank opened in 4 hours. Silas's men knew about the clinic, which meant they'd be watching Thorne's office next. He needed to move fast, retrieve whatever Jenna had hidden, and understand what game he'd been dragged into before more bodies started piling up. He returned to the office where Lila slept and pressed his lips to her forehead, an instinct he didn't know he possessed. I'll be back before you wake up, he whispered. And when I return, we're ending this. The city was still dark when Damien stepped onto the street, but dawn was bleeding at the edges of the skyline. Somewhere out there, Silas was making his next move. And Damien Rourke, who'd spent 6 years running from the only thing that mattered, was done running. Hit the like button if you think Silas made a fatal mistake attacking Damien's family. Only predators and cowards will keep scrolling. The medallion's weight pulled at his pocket like a promise, or a curse. Damien suspected he was about to discover which. First Continental Bank opened its doors at precisely 6 a.m., and Damien was the first customer through them, wearing a tailored suit that hid the gun at his spine and the violence still humming beneath his skin. The vault manager asked no questions. Old money never did, and escorted him down marble stairs into a cathedral of steel and silence, where secrets slept in numbered boxes. Box 1247 sat in the far corner, small and unassuming. Damien inserted the key the manager provided, turned it and pulled out a single manila envelope that weighed far more than paper should. Inside, an encrypted hard drive, photographs of bank transfers spanning 5 continents, and a handwritten note in Jenna's elegant script. If you're reading this, I'm either dead or close to it. Silas isn't just running guns anymore. He's blackmailing half the government with this. I couldn't let it continue. I'm sorry I dragged you into this. Protect our daughter. She's all that matters now, Jay. Our daughter. The words hit like a confession and an accusation all at once. Jenna had known, had raised Lila alone for 6 years while Damien played king in his tower. Convinced his absence was protection when it was just cowardice dressed in expensive suits. The photographs told a story of corruption so vast it made Damien's old empire look like a street corner hustle. Judges, politicians, police commissioners, all of them caught in compromising positions, all of them paying Silas for silence. And Jenna had stolen the proof, making herself a target and their daughter collateral damage. Touching, isn't it? The voice came from behind him, smooth as silk and twice as deadly. True love surviving even your spectacular talent for abandonment. Damien spun, gun already drawn, to find Silas leaning against the vault entrance with 4 armed men flanking him. His former lieutenant looked prosperous. Designer suit, gold watch, the satisfied smile of a man who'd rebuilt everything Damien had taken from him and then some. You always were sentimental, Damien. That's why you could never finish at what needed finishing. Silas stepped forward, unconcerned with the weapon aimed at his chest. I know about the girl, little Lila. Has your eyes, sweet child. Would be a shame if something happened to her while you're down here playing detective. Rage flooded Damien's veins like molten steel. If you touch her, you'll what? Kill me? We both know you won't. Silas's smile widened. That's always been your weakness. You grew a conscience, but don't worry about Lila. She's safe with Dr. Thorne, for now. It's Jenna you should be worried about. Damien's finger tightened on the trigger. Thorne said she was stabilized. Thorne is a brilliant surgeon, also brilliant at lying. Silas pulled out his phone, turned the screen toward Damien. The image showed Jenna, unconscious, strapped to a gurney in a location Damien recognized with sickening clarity. His old penthouse. The one he'd abandoned 2 years ago when memories of what he'd lost there became unbearable. She's alive, breathing, comfortable even. But the building has enough explosives wired into it to level 3 city blocks. Silas pocketed the phone. You have 2 hours to bring me that hard drive and walk away from everything. Your empire, your money, your little family fantasy. Or I detonate the charges and Jenna becomes a memory you'll spend the rest of your miserable life trying to forget. What would you do if someone threatened your family with this choice? Comment below. Silas turned toward the vault exit, his men moving with him. Oh, and Damien? If I even suspect you've copied those files, Jenna dies screaming. 2 hours, don't be late. The vault door slammed shut, leaving Damien alone with the evidence of Silas's empire and the impossible choice between justice and the woman he'd never stopped loving. Damien broke every traffic law written as he tore through the city toward the glass tower that still bore his name on the deed, the hard drive tucked into his jacket like a death sentence he was too stubborn to accept. 2 hours. Silas had given him 2 hours to choose between justice and love, between exposing corruption that killed thousands and saving the one woman who'd ever made him believe he was more than the monster everyone feared. There was no choice. There had never been a choice. The penthouse elevator climbed 40 floors in silence that screamed with memory, Jenna laughing in his kitchen, Jenna crying when he'd told her he couldn't risk loving her, Jenna walking out with nothing but a suitcase and the piece of his soul he'd never managed to reclaim. The doors opened onto his former kingdom, now retrofitted as Silas's torture chamber. Jenna lay strapped to a medical gurney in the center of the living room, IV lines snaking from her arms, her chest rising and falling in shallow, drugged rhythms. And Silas stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, backlit by dawn, looking like the devil admiring his handiwork. "You came alone. How noble." Silas gestured to the hard drive in Damien's hand. "Set it on the table and walk away. You get to keep your little family. I get to keep my empire. Everyone wins. Except the thousands of people you're extorting, the families you've destroyed, the children you've—" Damien's voice dropped to something subhuman. "You sent men to kill a 6-year-old girl, Silas, my 6-year-old girl. Collateral damage. You taught me that." Silas smiled, and it was the smile of a student who'd surpassed his master. "You built this city on bodies and fear. Don't pretend you're better than me just because you fell in love and grew weak." Damien set the hard drive on the table. Then he drew his gun and fired 3 rounds into it, shattering the casing, destroying the evidence, choosing Jenna over justice with the finality of a man who'd already made peace with damnation. "There, it's gone. Now let her go." Silas's smile vanished. "You destroyed it. You actually—" His hand moved toward the detonator in his pocket. "You stupid, sentimental fool. That was your insurance. Now you're just another body I have to bury." The fight that followed was primal, brutal, 2 apex predators tearing at each other with the accumulated rage of years of betrayal. Silas drew a knife. Damien caught his wrist, twisted until bone cracked, and drove his knee into Silas's ribs hard enough to collapse a lung. They crashed through furniture that had once cost more than most people earned in a year, smashing glass and memories with equal violence. Silas fought dirty, eye gouges, groin strikes, the tactics of a man with nothing to lose. But Damien fought like a father protecting his child, and that made him something far more dangerous than dirty. He caught Silas in a chokehold, squeezed until his former lieutenant's face turned purple, and whispered in his ear, "You threatened my daughter. That was the last mistake you'll ever make." Silas's hand fumbled for the detonator. Damien saw it too late. The button pressed, and the world exploded. Fire bloomed from every corner of the penthouse as charges detonated in sequence, turning Damien's former kingdom into an inferno. He released Silas's unconscious body and ran for Jenna, ripping away her restraints as flames ate through walls and the building's structure groaned like a dying beast. She was dead weight in his arms, drugged beyond consciousness. But he carried her toward the private elevator. The ceiling began to collapse. The elevator doors opened. Damien stumbled inside with Jenna cradled against his chest, slammed the emergency descent button, and felt the car drop as the penthouse above them disintegrated into fire and falling steel. Through the glass walls, he watched his old life burn, every memory, every mistake, every moment he'd chosen power over love, turning to ash. The elevator hit the ground floor. Damien kicked through the lobby doors and ran into dawn's light as the tower behind him collapsed floor by floor, a monument to everything he'd been falling into rubble. Jenna's pulse beat steady against his chest. Alive. Still fighting. Still his. Somewhere in the wreckage, Silas's body burned. But Damien knew in his bones that men like Silas didn't die easy. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Damien carried Jenna into the safe house 3 miles outside the city limits, a reinforced concrete bunker disguised as a suburban home that he'd purchased years ago under a name no one knew. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady, and he laid her on the bed with a gentleness that contradicted every violent act he'd committed in the last 12 hours. For the first time since that phone call shattered his world, he allowed himself to believe they might survive this. He returned to Dr. Thorne's clinic at dawn to find Lila exactly where he'd left her, curled on the office couch, still asleep. Damien gathered his daughter, The words were becoming real and carried her to the safe house, tucking her into the room adjacent to Jenna's. She stirred once, whispered, "Dad," like she was testing the word, and fell back into exhausted sleep. "Dad." The title settled on his shoulders like armor he'd never known he needed. With both of them safe, Damien finally allowed himself to examine what remained of Silas's operation. He'd destroyed the hard drive, but he'd photographed every document before the bank. Insurance against precisely this situation. The files painted a picture of corruption so vast it stretched across continents. Politicians, judges, corporate executives, all of them caught in Silas's web. But it was the financial records that made Damien's blood run cold. There, buried in a list of monthly payments to offshore accounts, was a name that stopped his heart. Dr. Marcus Thorne, $50,000 per month for the past 3 years. Consulting fees, the ledger claimed. But Damien knew exactly what those fees purchased. Access, information, the locations of every safe house Damien had ever used, the identities of every person he'd ever protected. Thorne, his oldest friend, the man he'd trusted with his daughter's life. The man is currently alone with Jenna in the next room. Damien's gun was in his hand before the thought finished forming. He crossed the safe house in 4 strides and kicked open Jenna's door to find the bed empty, sheets still warm, IV line torn free, and dripping saline onto carpet. The window stood open, curtains billowing in morning breeze, and on the pillow where Jenna's head had rested lay a single piece of paper with Thorne's elegant handwriting. "I'm sorry, old friend, but Silas pays better than loyalty, and you of all people should understand that everyone has a price. She's alive. For now. If you want her back, come alone to the address below. And Damien, bring Lila. Silas wants the whole family together for the finale." The address was a location Damien recognized with sick familiarity. The abandoned meatpacking plant on the waterfront, a place he'd used for interrogations back when he was building his empire one broken bone at a time. Thorne knew he'd recognize it, knew the memories would make him reckless. Damien crumpled the note in his fist, rage and betrayal warring in his chest. He'd trusted Thorne with everything, his secrets, his wounds, his family. And Thorne had been selling him to Silas for 3 years, every confidence weaponized, every vulnerability cataloged, is priced. He checked on Lila, still sleeping peacefully, unaware her world had just shattered again. Damien couldn't bring her, wouldn't. Whatever Silas and Thorne wanted, his daughter would not be bait in their trap. But Jenna was already caught, and every second he delayed was another second she spent in the hands of men who saw her as nothing more than leverage. Subscribe if you believe traitors like Thorne deserve no mercy. Only backstabbers and snakes will keep scrolling. Damien locked the safe house from the outside, set every alarm, and left his daughter sleeping behind 6 inches of reinforced steel. Then he loaded every weapon he owned and drove toward the waterfront, toward the friend who'd betrayed him and the woman he'd failed to protect. This time there would be no mercy, no second chance, no walking away. This time everyone who'd touched his family would learn exactly why the city had once feared the name Damien Rourke. Damien was 3 miles from the waterfront when the tracker app on his phone suddenly pulsed with a signal he hadn't expected. He'd sewn a micro GPS into the hem of Jenna's hospital gown at Thorne's clinic, old habits from a life built on paranoia, and now that tracker was moving, but not toward the meatpacking plant. It was heading east, toward the industrial district, away from the trap Thorne had laid. Damien pulled a hard U-turn, tires screaming against asphalt, and followed the blinking dot on his screen. Either Thorne had changed locations or something had gone wrong with his carefully orchestrated plan. Either way, Jenna was moving, and that meant she was alive. The tracker led him to an abandoned warehouse complex, the kind of place where cargo containers went to die and questions were never asked. Damien parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, gun drawn, every sense screaming ambush. But when he slipped through a broken side door, what he found wasn't a trap. It was Jenna, conscious and alone, hunched against a rusted support beam with her hospital gown torn and bloody, but her eyes fierce and aware. She looked up as Damien entered, and the relief that flooded her face nearly brought him to his knees. "Jenna," He was beside her in seconds, checking for new injuries, his hands shaking as they ghosted over her skin. "Thorn took you. I found the note. How did you—" "I got away." Her voice was hoarse but steady. She pressed something into his hand, a folded piece of paper, worn soft like she'd been carrying it for months. "I need you to read this before you go after Thorn. Before you do something you can't take back." Damien unfolded the letter, recognizing Jenna's handwriting, but the date at the top stopped him cold. 6 months ago, long before the phone call, before the clinic attack, before everything fell apart. "Damien, if you're reading this, then I'm either dead or close enough that it doesn't matter anymore. I need you to know the truth about Marcus Thorn. I've known he was working with Silas for almost a year. I found the payments, tracked the communications. He's been selling your secrets since shortly after you exiled Silas, helping him rebuild his empire piece by piece. But here's what you need to understand. I let him think I didn't know. I played the grateful patient, the trusting friend, because as long as Thorn believed he was fooling me, I could control what information reached Silas. I fed Thorn false leads about my investigation, sent him on dead ends, used his betrayal to protect Lila. Marcus isn't evil, Damien. He's weak. Silas found his gambling debts and his dying sister and offered him a lifeline wrapped in chains. Thorn sold you out to save someone he loved, just like you pushed me away 6 years ago to keep me safe. Both of you made the same mistake, thinking you could control the damage by choosing isolation. Don't kill him. Don't become the man you were before you learned that mercy is stronger than vengeance. Thorn has been feeding Silas bad information for 3 months now, ever since I convinced him to turn. He's not your enemy anymore. He's your regret wearing someone else's face. I love you. I never stopped. And when this is over, when Silas is gone and the world stops burning, come find me. Come find us. Lila needs her father, and I need the man who taught me that even monsters can choose to be heroes. Always, Joe. Damien's hands trembled as he finished reading. Jenna had known, had orchestrated everything, had turned his betrayer into a double agent, and never told him because she'd understood something he'd forgotten. Redemption wasn't about revenge. It was about choosing differently when the same choice appeared again. Thorn's been helping me for months, Jenna whispered. The note he left was a message for Silas's men. He's buying us time while they chase ghosts at the meatpacking plant. But Damien, Silas knows the truth now. He knows Thorn turned, and he's going to kill him for it unless you... Have you ever had to forgive someone who betrayed you to save someone else? Comment Mercy Matters below. Damien pulled Jenna into his arms, burying his face in her hair, feeling 6 years of armor crack and fall away. She'd been protecting him, protecting Lila, protecting even the man who'd sold them out, because she'd seen what Damien had forgotten. Everyone was fighting their own war, and sometimes the casualties were just people who'd made impossible choices in impossible situations. Where is he? Damien asked. The bunker beneath your old office building. Silas is torturing him for the truth about where I hid Lila. Jenna's fingers gripped his jacket. Save him, Damien. Not because he deserves it, because we do. Because choosing mercy is how we stop this cycle from destroying everyone we love. Damien stood, pulled Jenna to her feet, and for the first time in 6 years, kissed the woman who'd never stopped believing he could be more than violence wearing human skin. Then he ran toward the man who'd betrayed him, to save him from the fate they both deserved. The bunker beneath Damien's old office building had been designed to withstand nuclear war, but it couldn't withstand the fury of a father who'd finally learned what was worth fighting for. Damien descended the reinforced stairwell with his gun drawn, and Jenna's letter burning in his pocket like a second conscience, reminding him that the man he used to be had died in the flames of that penthouse and something better needed to rise from the ashes. The bunker door hung open, an invitation or a trap. It didn't matter which. Damien stepped through into a concrete cathedral lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made the blood on the floor look black instead of red. Dr. Marcus Thorn knelt in the center of the room, hands zip-tied behind his back, face swollen from methodical violence, and Silas stood over him with a pistol pressed to the back of his skull. Right on time, Silas said, his voice pleasant despite the blood splattered across his expensive suit. He'd survived the penthouse collapse with nothing worse than burns and broken ribs, held together by rage and the kind of hatred that refused to die easy. Your old friend here finally admitted he's been playing both sides, feeding me lies while helping Jenna steal my empire piece by piece. Very disappointing. Damien's gun never wavered from Silas's center mass. Let him go. This is between us. Everything is between us, Damien. It always has been. Silas smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd already won. You exiled me for refusing to limit my ambitions. You built a kingdom on bodies, and then pretended you were too noble for the consequences. And now you're playing hero because you knocked up some woman and accidentally created a conscience. It's pathetic. Thorne's voice came out broken, barely human. Damien, I'm sorry. I was weak. My sister needed treatment I couldn't afford. And Silas offered. I know, Damien interrupted, his eyes never leaving Silas. Jenna told me everything. You've been helping her for months, feeding Silas bad intel, trying to undo what you'd done. That's why you're still breathing. Silas's gun pressed harder against Thorne's skull. How touching. The monster has learned forgiveness, but here's the problem with mercy, old friend. It makes you predictable. I knew you'd come for him, knew you'd hesitate, and that hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The gunshot never came. Damien had already moved, his bullet catching Silas in the shoulder and spinning him away from Thorne before the hammer fell. Silas's weapon clattered across concrete as he stumbled backward, clutching his ruined shoulder, his face twisted with shock and agony. You shot me. You actually... Blood seeped between Silas's fingers. After everything, after all your talk of mercy and redemption, you chose violence. I chose protection. Damien kicked Silas's gun away and then moved to Thorne, cutting the zip ties with a knife from his boot. The doctor collapsed forward, gasping, alive. There's a difference between mercy and stupidity. I'm not gonna let you execute a man who's trying to make amends. Silas laughed, a wet, pained sound. You think you've won? You think sparing me makes you better than what you were? You're still a killer, Damien. Still a monster. The only difference is now you've got a daughter who'll grow up knowing exactly what her father is. And there it was, the test. The moment where the old Damien would have put 2 bullets in Silas's chest and walked away clean. Where the king who'd built an empire on fear would have eliminated the threat permanently and called it justice. Damien's finger tightened on the trigger. Muscle memory and 6 years of choosing violence over vulnerability screaming at him to finish this. Then he saw Lila's eyes in his mind. Those gray eyes that mirrored his own, that had watched him kill 4 men without flinching, that carried the weight of understanding that her father was a monster who was trying desperately to be a man. Damien lowered his gun. You're right, he said quietly. I am a killer. I've done things that would make decent people sick. But my daughter doesn't need me to be perfect. She needs me to be better. And better starts with choosing differently when the same choice appears again. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his eyes never leaving Silas's shocked face. I need police and paramedics at the bunker beneath 1247 Industrial Boulevard. Multiple casualties. The man responsible for the First Continental blackmail operation is here and needs immediate arrest and medical attention. Silas stared at him like he'd grown a second head. You're calling the cops? They'll arrest you too. You killed 4 men at that clinic. You destroyed my building. I know what I've done. Damien crouched beside Silas, close enough to see the fear finally bleeding into his former lieutenant's eyes. And I'll answer for all of it. But not before I make sure you spend the rest of your life in a cage where you can't hurt anyone else's family ever again. Comment, I choose mercy, if you believe Damien made the right choice. Only people who think revenge is stronger than redemption will stay silent. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Thorne pushed himself to his feet, swaying, and looked at Damien with something that might have been gratitude or grief. You should run. You've got time to get Jenna and Lila and disappear before... No more running, Damien said. I've spent 6 years running from the only thing that mattered. I'm done. The bunker filled with armed police within minutes, tactical lights cutting through shadow. Voices demanding surrender. Damien set his gun on the ground and raised his hands, feeling the weight of every choice he'd ever made settle on his shoulders like chains. But for the first time in 6 years, those chains felt like freedom, because somewhere above ground, his daughter was safe, and the man who'd threatened her was going to prison instead of a grave. Damien Rourke, the monster who'd ruled the city through fear, had finally learned that the strongest choice a father could make was mercy, even when vengeance would have been so much easier. 3 months later, Damien Rourke stood on the deck of a tall house perched above the Pacific coastline, watching his daughter chase seagulls across sand that stretched empty and clean toward a horizon that promised nothing but tomorrows. Lila's laughter carried on the salt wind, pure and unbroken, the sound of a child who was finally learning that safety didn't have to come with walls and armed guards, and a father who smelled like gunpowder and regret. The legal aftermath had been brutal, but fair. Damien had cooperated fully with federal prosecutors, providing testimony that dismantled what remained of Silas's blackmail empire and exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. In exchange for his cooperation and the evidence Jenna had gathered, he'd received immunity from prosecution for the clinic shootings. Self-defense, the DA had ruled. Protection of family against armed assault. The other crimes, the years of running the underworld, those had been harder to wash away. But Damien had walked away from his empire completely, transferring assets to legitimate businesses, severing ties with every criminal enterprise that bore his name, choosing to be poor and present rather than powerful and absent. Silas had received 40 years federal prison, no possibility of parole. The last Damien heard, his former lieutenant spent his days in administrative segregation, kept away from general population because too many inmates wanted revenge for the lives he destroyed. DeBarnthorne had been given almost a suspended sentence in mandatory community service. His cooperation and Jenna's testimony about his eventual redemption, convincing the judge that some betrayals deserve second chances. He'd written Damien a letter last month, asking for forgiveness. Damien wasn't sure he could give, but no longer needed to withhold. Mercy, he'd learned, wasn't about feelings. It was about choosing not to let the past poison the future. Jenna emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd been broken and put back together stronger. The surgery Thorne had performed had saved her life, but recovery had taken months of physical therapy and quiet mornings where she'd had to relearn how to trust that Damien wouldn't disappear the moment things got difficult. They weren't married yet. That conversation was still coming. Whispered in darkness when Lila was asleep, and honesty was the only currency they traded. But they were building something neither of them had names for, a life measured not in power or fear, but in shared meals and homework help, and the radical act of choosing each other every single day. She asked about school this morning, Jenna said, settling beside him on the weathered deck railing. Wanted to know if the kids would be mean to her because her dad used to be a criminal. Damien's jaw tightened. What did you tell her? I told her that her dad used to make bad choices, but now he makes brave ones, and that anyone who judges her for your past isn't worth her time. Jenna's hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the familiarity of 6 years lost and 3 months rebuilt. She's proud of you, Damien. Proud that you chose to be her father instead of staying a king. Down on the beach, Lila turned and waved, her braids whipping in the wind, her smile wider than the sky. Damien waved back, feeling something in his chest that had been cold for 6 years finally warm. This was what Jenna had tried to tell him all those years ago when she'd walked away. That power without connection was just expensive loneliness, and kingdoms built on fear were prisons that locked the king inside. I'm thinking about getting away, Damien said. Something normal. Construction, maybe, or working at the marina. Something where I come home tired and normal and boring. Jenna laughed, the sound like music he'd forgotten how to hear. You could never be boring, but normal sounds perfect. They stood together in silence, watching their daughter play, watching the sun paint the water gold and crimson, watching the life they'd almost lost take shape in small, precious moments that added up to everything. No empire, no fear, no running, just 3 people who'd survived their own worst choices, learning how to build something better from the wreckage. Damien's phone buzzed, a text from the contracting company he'd interviewed with last week, offering him a position starting Monday. 40 hours a week, union benefits. A paycheck that would barely cover their modest rent but came without blood on the money. He showed Jenna the screen, and she kissed his cheek, whispering congratulations against his skin. Lila ran up the beach stairs, breathless and sandy and alive. "Dad, can we build a sandcastle, a huge one with towers and walls and a moat?" "Dad," the word still made his chest ache, but now the ache was sweet instead of sharp. Damien scooped his daughter into his arms. She was getting too big for this, growing too fast, but he wasn't ready to stop carrying her yet, and headed down toward the beach where kingdoms were made of sand instead of blood, and tomorrow morning he'd wake up as nothing more dangerous than a father who'd learned that the greatest power was knowing when to walk away. "The biggest sandcastle ever built," he promised, and meant it. "With your mom as the queen, and you as the princess, and me as the guard who actually shows up when you call." Lila wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered in his ear, "I'm glad you answered my phone call." "Me too, sweetheart." Damien's voice cracked around the truth. "Me too." Behind them, the house stood small and imperfect against the coastline. No armed guards, no reinforced walls, no empire to protect or maintain. Just a home, just a family, just a man who'd been given a second chance and chosen every single day to deserve it. If this story reminded you that it's never too late to choose differently, that redemption is possible even for people who've done terrible things, that being present is more powerful than being feared, then subscribe right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear that second chances aren't just for the people who deserve them. They're for everyone brave enough to take them. Hit the like button if you believe Damien Rourke became the father Lila needed him to be. And comment below, what would you have done differently if you were given a second chance at the thing that mattered most? Your story might save someone else's life. We'll see you in the next one, where love, redemption, and the courage to choose mercy over vengeance remind us all that the hardest battles are the ones we fight against who we used to be. Damien Rourke was no longer the king of anything, but he was the father of everything that mattered, and that throne was the only one worth keeping.